Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 662 through 664, which will cover manga chapters 730 through 732. And we are now heading into the third act of the Dressrosa arc, and it starts off with a pretty shocking reveal. So, synopsis: with everything set in place, it is now time to enact the Operation Dressrosa SOP plan to take down Doflamingo and the Don Quixote family. However, Luffy is stuck inside the Colosseum, but a shocking person from his past will come to his aid. Okay, so differences. Like the last arc, I guess the entire arc, there are a lot of smaller differences, but I'll talk about some of the main ones. So, the anime at the end of episode 662 kind of ruins one of the biggest surprise reveals before it's supposed to happen, as it clearly teases Sabo's return very early. Like, I don't know how you could not recognize that this is Sabo. And I absolutely hate that they did this, because I vividly remember how shocked I was to read the actual moment when you are meant to understand that Sabo is alive and back, which is after Luffy makes that crazy shocked face. And I hate that the anime, ruins it for basically anime-only watchers that won't get to experience this moment how I and many manga readers got to experience this, and it kind of sucks. Like, I know it's still a pretty shocking reveal, and it builds up the anticipation, but I don't know. For me, I just vividly remember just how shocked I was that Sabo was here. Not that he was still alive, because obviously I already knew that or at least I had a very good suspicion that he was still alive, based on all the clues that had been laid out for us. But yeah, it was still nonetheless very shocking for him to be here. And so I hate that this moment doesn't quite hit as hard in the anime. The other difference that I wanted to mention is the anime shows Dellinger beating down Bellamy, and also Bellamy trying to fight back. But in the manga, we don't actually see this, and it cuts straight to where Bartolomeo is already protecting Bellamy. And the anime also shows Diamante calling Dellinger in real time with his new orders, instead of the manga, for some reason, shows this happening in a flashback panel in that scene. So I think I actually prefer the anime version to this one, because it just seems to flow better. I'm not entirely sure why it was necessary to flashback, but I guess with the way Oda did it, because it just cuts straight to Bartolomeo already protecting him, maybe that's why he felt like he needed to do that, but it just seems weird. The last thing I wanted to mention is when Luffy regroups with Bartolomeo as he's carrying Bellamy, Bartolomeo's reaction to meeting Luffy again is for some reason extremely downplayed. In the anime, he just kind of is excited and starstruck by being blinded by Luffy's presence. But in the manga, he over dramatically bends over backwards like he's doing a suplex with his head almost slamming into the ground, and he starts foaming at the mouth. And I know Toei has this sort of weird aversion to showing foaming mouths for some reason in the anime, and so that might be the reason for the change, but it seems strange to draw the line there in terms of censorship when there are far worse things shown in One Piece. But I think especially since this bothers me a little bit, because Oda's shorthand to show someone has really been sort of knocked unconscious by being overwhelmed mentally or psychologically, like, via Conqueror's Haki, or when Usopp overwhelms Perona with cockroaches. That's like Oda's way of showing that this really got to them. And the anime, for some reason, never shows anyone with foaming mouths. It's really weird. I don't know what the reason behind this is, actually. But yeah, that's pretty much all the differences I wanted to mention. I know there are a lot more smaller ones here and there, but they're so tiny that it's not worth picking each one of them out. So let's just get into the episodes themselves. So, continuing from the shocking cliffhanger from the last episode with Law being shot multiple times by Doflamingo in front of many people, including the citizens, the Marines, as well as Luffy, Zoro, and Kinemon. Zoro and Kinemon immediately jump in to save Law, but unlucky for them, Fujitora jumps in to confront Zoro, and this is getting absolutely nuts, as now Zoro is in a direct fight with an admiral and is immediately sent into a hole in the ground, but is able to get out by somehow being able to launch a 36-pound cannon up at him, which is pretty impressive considering the position he was in, on his back with his arms to his side. He was still able to fling his sword up to fire off, the flying slash. For Fujitora's part here, he once again shows a lot of his good-natured side once he realizes that he can't neutralize Zoro all that easily, and this might turn into a more widespread fight, especially when he notes that Zoro is capable of launching ranged slashes, and he realizes that these attacks could inadvertently hit innocent civilians, and orders his men to prioritize getting the onlookers to safety. Although I will add that this line is added for the anime, but it still seems like something that he would say, and I still really like it. Then he acknowledges how he's grateful for their help back at the gambling bar, but it's unfortunate that this is how he has to repay them. And I like that he says that to Zoro. Like, this guy is probably even more honorable and good-natured than Kuzan was when he was Aokiji. In fact, he might be the most upstanding marine we've met outside of like Kobe and Tashigi, but he far surpasses either of them in strength or rank, which is why this is so significant to see Fujitora be like this. And this is also the scene where, for the first time, we get to hear the nickname that Luffy gives Doflamingo, because Doflamingo is probably too many syllables for Luffy to remember or care to even say. And it's interesting because his family already has a nickname for him, which is Dofi, but Oda uses the reverse part of his name for Luffy because, of course, he's his opponent, and calls him Mingo instead. And I can't quite pinpoint why, but I love this because it sounds ridiculous enough to the point where it almost like sounds like Luffy is disrespecting him. But I don't think for Luffy there was any thought behind it other than I need to shorten his name so I can say it easier. It's pretty funny though. Doflamingo whispers something we can't hear to Fujitora, and instead of pursuing it any further, he has Fujitora lift both of them with Law captive and take him to the palace, seemingly having a plan for how he wants to deal with the Straw Hats. And this forces Zoro and Kinemon to have to run, but not before relaying to Luffy that they'll be nearby, so that he needs to find a way out of the Colosseum. But there's one line that Luffy says here that I want to draw your attention to, because it's yet another example of Luffy possessing what Rayleigh called the voice of all things. And it's pretty easy to miss, but like on Fishman Island, Luffy's ability to understand the Sea Kings and hear their voices and hear the voice of things, even if they can't speak like directly with their mouths or whatever. And Luffy here specifically talks about how he could still hear Law's voice, which is why he knows Law is still alive, even though we know for a fact that Law never said a word since crashing down, and especially not since he was shot. So now we know that Luffy can actually sense people and hear their sort of voices, not just Sea Kings or animals. He can hear people. Whether Luffy can actually hear their thoughts like he did with the Sea Kings, that's still unclear in terms of what capacity he can use this ability, or if it's actually like some sort of a telepathy, or is it more like he can sense their life force, kind of similar to like sensing Ki in Dragon Ball, or using the Force in Star Wars. This is probably one of the more mysterious, subtle, and less developed abilities that Luffy has. It'll be interesting to see what Oda is planning with this ability, and why it's been such a slow drip feed, only appearing like every once in a long while. And even when it does appear, it's often very understated and not even obvious that it is the voice of all things. And you kind of have to sort of infer whether he's using the voice of all things or whether he's using observation haki at this point. And most of the time, if you're paying attention, you can pick up on certain clues to help you determine which is which. Or sometimes they will just outright state it, that it is observation haki or it is the voice of all things. But it's very rarely actually differentiated when it does happen. But anyways, all hell breaks loose at this point, as the crew on the Sunny is now all of a sudden being pursued by the Yonko Big Mom's pirate ship, which who the hell saw that one coming? Big Mom's ship, true to her name, is big. Her ship is absolutely mind-bogglingly massive. Just to put it into perspective, the Thousand Sunny is reportedly 56 meters tall, or about 184 feet tall. That's like a 15-story building. And Big Mom's ship, the Queen Mama Chanter, dwarfs the Sunny. I don't know the exact height, but if we were to take the panel of the ship behind the Sunny, you can count about 5 1/4 Sunnies, which would put the Queen Mama Chanter at around 294 or about 300 meters tall, or roughly 965 feet. That's about the size of the Chrysler Building in New York City, which is around 319 meters tall, or about the height of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, minus the top antenna, just the main structure, which is just freaking massive for a pirate ship. Not to mention, it seems to also have sentience and can talk for some reason, which is just crazy as well. Now, Pecoms and Baron Tamago are there, and it looks like they're after Caesar too, but unlike Doflamingo, he doesn't want to go back with them, as it looks like he was taking funds from her for some kind of requisition, but instead he didn't deliver and just took the funds, and it looks like she wants them to pay back now. And it's not clear whether Big Mom is actually on the ship with them, but yeah, you'd think if she was there, they would have showed it by now. But yeah, it's crazy. And of course, they can't fight back, and all they can do is run. But this is where Nami, like the secondary captain she always has been, takes control and has Brooke take the helm for evasive maneuvers and calmly lays out the situation and rationalizes what Law must have been going for, and the 3 cards that they hold on, and recommending that they don't return to Dressrosa and instead continue on to Zou like Law had told them in order to protect the 2 VIPs. Luffy agrees and allows them to continue on. And like I was mentioning in the last podcast episode about that moment where Luffy trusts his crew and allows them to take command when necessary, this is one of those, and it's immediately followed by another really cool moment where Sanji then asks Luffy's permission to launch a counterattack against the Big Mom pirate crew. And this is such a badass moment because it really does feel like they have become a solidified crew and not just kind of piecing things together as they went along in the pre-time skip era. Kind of like how Zoro mentions during the sort of Usopp apology speech. He's like, we're not playing pirates anymore. Like, I feel like this is the point where, yeah, they have really graduated to like full-on legitimate pirate crew. However, this does mean that outside of the separation serial, this will be the first time the crew will be split up between 2 islands. And we didn't know it at the time, but it will be a very long time in real world time before they actually all get back together as a crew. So definitely savor this, because this is the last time they will all be in the same island for a while. And one thing this scene jump-started in my mind at the time was all of a sudden I realized the position that they needed for their next crew member, because it was never outright stated what their next position or what their position of need was. And to me, this scene proved that it was a helmsman, essentially the driver of the ship, someone who was an expert at steering and maneuvering a big ship. And when Nami yelled for Brook to take the helm, and then Brook just kind of doing his best but not really knowing what he was doing, just immediately made me realize the need for one. Particularly until this point in the story, outside of the archaeologist and the sniper, which sort of both happened by accident, each member Luffy actively went looking for. So it was always obvious what position he needed and he was seeking. But pretty much since Brook, he's got most of the major positions that he wanted locked down. So we haven't really had one of those moments where Luffy states that he needs someone to fill a specific position, whether it be musician, navigator, cook, doctor, shipwright. And of course, Luffy has technically already invited a new crew member who is currently without an actual position yet. And so that position could easily go to Jinbei. And since he is a fisherman, he knows how to navigate water and currents very well. And this was even referenced all the way back in the Arlong Park arc when Chu, Kurobi, and Hachi sank that ship, the marine ship, by manipulating the currents when they all shift that giant rock underwater, causing these massive whirlpools, sinking the marine ship. Of course, half of Jinbei's moveset is him just manipulating water currents, so he could easily fill that spot when he officially joins the crew for good, but we'll see. Now, episode 663 starts off showing us what happened with Bellamy after Dellinger caught up to him, and it's pretty brutal, but unexpectedly, Bartolomeo comes in to save Bellamy from being killed by Dellinger. And at first I thought this was really strange, like why would Bartolomeo help Bellamy? I initially thought maybe Luffy asked him to help Bellamy off screen or something, but that wasn't the case, as we find out that he did this of his own accord, and the explanation he gives is very Luffy-like though. He wanted to help because after sharing the ring together and having a great match, that makes them friends in a way, and that's pretty much exactly what Luffy would do. So not only does Bartolomeo idolize Luffy, but he's being inspired by Luffy's actions and behavior. And this is definitely an aspect of Luffy's superpower that I hadn't really thought of. Like, we know that several antagonistic pirates have sort of changed their ways after encountering Luffy, like Buggy and the Baroque Works. But this is the first time Luffy's influence has reached a pirate crew that he's never actually met directly. And this is pretty incredible that he's changing pirates for the better even without meeting them. And he may not be the Pirate King yet, but he's already starting to have a wider influence around the world in positive ways. And I thought that was really interesting and noteworthy because it kind of expands on the sort of the superpower that Mihawk mentioned during the Marineford War. And he noted, how Luffy's scariest power is not his strength or his devil fruit or anything. It's the fact that he's so easily able to draw people in and change them to his cause. And it's basically, this is just another expansion of that. And also another reason to love Bartolomeo. And also, surprisingly, when Bellamy went from one of the most hated characters in the series to one of the more sympathetic ones, which Oda, again, is just a master at doing, all of this coming together is a really cool moment. Luffy, now with the sole goal of finding some way to get out of the Colosseum, runs into Bartolomeo and Bellamy. And like I said, I love anytime Bartolomeo is on screen, how he just absolutely fanboys over Luffy so much to the point where he starts to sink deeper and deeper into his accent, to the point where even Luffy comments on the fact that his accent is getting heavier as he speaks, when Bartolomeo sweetly explains to him that it was always his intention to win the Mera Mera fruit for Luffy in the first place. And this is, of course, lost in kind of translation since the subs don't really do much to sort of differentiate Bartolomeo's speech pattern. But in Japanese, he does have a very distinct Japanese accent or dialect called Tohoku-ben, which is, of course, native to the Tohoku region, which is kind of located sort of the northeastern region of the Honshu prefecture. It's kind of like sort of a, I guess I could equate to like a country bumpkin style of speaking. As you'll notice, he ends his sentence with dabe a lot. And I don't know this accent too well personally, as I can only recall one other character in any media who speaks this way, and that's Chi-Chi, Goku's wife in Dragon Ball. And I guess her father, the Ox King too, by extension. And yeah, sure enough, as he's talking, it slips further and further into Tohoku-ben dialect as he's not just adding dabe at the end of his sentences, but he's basically starting to replace every other word. And the way I understand it is the unique quality of the Tohoku-ben is that it softens the Japanese language up. And it even starts to sound like they're kind of slurring the words together. So it's just like it just flows better. And the word that Oda actually highlights in the manga when Bartolomeo says to Luffy about the Mera Mera fruit, he's like, of course it belongs to you. In normal Japanese, it should sound like mochiron da, anata ga motsu beki da. But the way Bartolomeo says of course in Tohoku-ben, instead of the harder mochiron da, the mochi, it's said like motsuron da. It replaces the harsh chi sound and with the tsu, so it just sounds like it doesn't have that sharpness. And Oda actually puts dots next to the word motsuronda, and just to kind of highlight this even further. And just as an aside, I love this other joke that the anime adds where Bartolomeo, after he screams all this, Bellamy just sat there on the ground like wounded. He's like, who the hell are you yelling this to? It's pretty funny because but Bellamy is like, he's still very serious right now and contemplating his life decisions. And it's in a very like dark and serious place. But I just find it really funny how he's just sitting there watching this psycho just yelling nonsense to his like idol. And Bellamy's just like, what is happening right now? That I do really like that joke that they added. I think that was a good joke, even though it kind of breaks the tension a little bit. And yeah, speaking of Bellamy, on the other hand, he's willing to help Luffy find a way out, but he's still having a hard time accepting that Doflamingo has really abandoned him. And it's pretty obvious that deep down, he fully realizes that it's over, but he doesn't want anyone else to seemingly know, especially not Luffy, which is why he silences Bartolomeo when he tries to remind him about the earlier interaction with Dellinger and Diamante. And I also believe it's because he says he wants to hear it from Doflamingo's mouth and confirm it for himself before he actually like voices it in himself. It's pretty tragic when you think about it, almost kind of like Gin and Don Krieg. Like, they both just chose the wrong man to follow and look up to. I'm honestly impressed with how Oda basically turned Bellamy into from this like one-dimensional side villain into a three-dimensional character with his own complex motivations, flaws, and a complete character arc by this point. And I'm actually rooting for him to actually get this redemption, which is something I never would have expected based on his first appearance, where all I wanted was Luffy to just beat the crap out of him, which he does. And it's definitely one of the more satisfying punches in the entire series, like we've talked about. But yeah, I'm actually pretty shocked that like my opinion of Bellamy has completely done a 180. It's crazy. But it's here that we get the big reunion, although it's not outright revealed quite yet, at least in the manga. But we all know who this is, regardless of all the big hints from the anime or even the more subtle hints in the manga. And regardless of how controversial this character's appearance is at this point in the story, it doesn't take away from how amazing this chapter was when it dropped. I remember being overwhelmed with emotions when I first read it, and even to this day, I still get chills and goosebumps reading and watching this moment. That full page image of Luffy's shocked face is always so ingrained in my mind. But enough beating around the bush. So this is where it's revealed that Sabo is alive and here on Dressrosa, meeting Luffy for the first time since they were kids. And I can't tell you the shock, excitement, nostalgia, and joy I felt when reading this chapter. Many of us knew that Sabo was alive based on all the clues, but also there was a large subset of the fan base that hadn't picked up on that because many people don't read the cover stories or forgot about the small details in the flashback post Marineford. So many of them, it was a complete shock that he was still alive at all, but it was also never even registered in my mind that we would see him like this, especially just out of the blue. I think for me, I just felt so happy for Luffy. After all the pain that he endured losing Ace, he at least got one brother back that he thought he had lost. And seeing him getting emotional and just sobbing in the koi fish costume is so amazing. Like, my heart always feels so full and warm whenever I see this episode or read this chapter, because you just want to see Luffy be happy, especially with what he went through with Ace. And the feeling the way Luffy feels relieved that the Meta fruit will be in good hands now, because we now finally have our answer to what is to become of the Meta no Mi. And that is probably the best person to carry on Ace's will. And it will be his brother Sabo. Sabo will most definitely become the new user of the Meta fruit. I can't think of a better person to have it, and he takes Luffy's place donning the Lucy disguise to fight in his place while Luffy is able to now leave to go face Doflamingo and help his crew. And I've mentioned this, this in my favorite jokes episode, but I absolutely love the disguises that Kinemon creates with his powers for them to blend in while they travel across Dressrosa. They look even more conspicuous, I feel like, as they aren't really toys. And what always gets me is sort of the blank stares of the costumes not matching the emotions of each character, especially the cat costume that Zoro is in. Like, we will get a little bit more into these as we see the costumes in action, but needless to say, it's freaking hysterical to me. And I love how Zoro is absolutely confused and kind of annoyed at what Luffy is even talking about and crying about. And he's just kind of like overjoyed with the fact that Sabo is alive and can't even string together a coherent answer. And honestly, I'm just happy for Luffy here that we got to see Sabo and learn that he's alive and ready to fight for Ace's will. However, the big reveals aren't over yet with just Sabo, as we learn who that girl that Hack was communicating with is also with Sabo, and it's the reveal of another returning character that I had not expected to see, which is a grown-up koala. The little girl that Fisher Tiger and Jinbei helped to save back in the Fishman Island flashback. Not only that, but she's part of the Revolutionary Army now, and even further, she is an assistant master of Fishman Karate, which is such an amazing development. Like, what Fisher Tiger did for her wasn't in vain. This is proof. She never forgot what he and the other fishmen did for her, and this proves that his choice to help her, even at the cost of his own life, wasn't a mistake. She took that experience and what Fisher Tiger did through that and not only mastered Fishman karate, the fighting style of her saviors, but is now using it to fight against the world government to help Fishman and countless others. Another sort of amazing and very emotional development and payoff to something that was set up years ago. If only Jinbei were here with the Straw Hats now to maybe meet Koala and see her all grown up, I think that's the only thing that would have made it perfect. But unfortunately, Jinbei isn't here with them, which kind of sucks. So that is something I am looking forward to seeing someday is Koala and Jinbei meeting up again at some point. As far as I know, it hasn't happened yet. But with that reveal, this now means that including all these other forces, that the Revolutionary Army is also here, and a Sabo that will soon possess the Mera Mera fruit will be on their side to help fight against the Marines and the Don Quixote family. In my mind at the time, I thought what they were going for is sort of to help fend off the Marines while everyone else is fighting the Don Quixote family. And everything was kind of like starting to come together. And this was like really exciting. It was like, finally, let's get going. Because Dressrosa, even if it's a slightly better pace in the manga, it's still a slow burn. Like it still takes a lot of setup before you actually get to anything really like exciting. It has a ton of characters to introduce and to build up. It has to build up all the different scenarios. It has to build up the Don Quixote family, Fujitora. Like, it has a ton to set up. So the pacing of this arc is definitely sort of weighed down a little bit because of just the scale of Dressrosa. And so the pacing, it is slower, and the anime just makes it even 10 times worse. And so, yeah, now that we're finally getting into the meat and potatoes of Dressrosa, it's finally starting to like really, cook. But so as amazing as this moment was, there is a decent amount of controversy when it comes to Sabo and his return for a few reasons. A not insignificant group of the fanbase seem to either not like the character or feel like his return is unnecessary or even unearned. And I personally don't have a problem with Sabo nor his reappearance. I think his return was set up and foreshadowed well in advance, so it didn't feel unearned or random. And as a character, I think he's fine. He's not necessarily my favorite character or anything, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Oda hasn't really developed him all that much outside of the flashback during the post-Marineford arc. I think where most people have an issue with Sabo is that they feel that he's essentially Ace Light, or like Diet Ace, a cheap imitation of Ace, or even taking it one step further. Some people believe that his return somehow cheapens Ace's death. And I can kind of understand where they're coming from, because he essentially does just come back to fill a lot of Ace's role as a character, as Luffy's older brother, and he also will eventually possess the Mera fire, powers. And while I do understand where they're coming from, I think Sabo is a much different character and serves a very different purpose in the story. To the argument that it cheapens Ace's death, I don't think it cheapens Ace's death at all. As you will see as the story progresses, Ace's influence, his character, and death still leaves a lasting impact in many different ways that are wholly separate from Sabo and even Luffy. But like I said, I think Sabo's biggest sin is that he's just kind of bland as a One Piece character, mostly because Oda, like I said, hasn't really done much with the Revolutionary Army in general, and by extension Sabo as well. I mean, only now where we are in the story, around like chapter 1100, chapter 1000, like in that area is where we start to see Sabo a little bit more. But even then, he's still not really doing too much. And unfortunately, there is still one more controversy with Sabo, and that's concerning his voice actor. So Sabo is played by Toru Furuya, who is most famous for playing characters like Yamcha in Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, as well as every other Dragon Ball, and Bourbon in Detective Conan. And he was a very well-known voice actor in the industry since the 70s, but in May of 2024, he admitted in an interview that he had an extramarital affair with a woman 37 years younger than him, and I think he's like 71 right now, but at the time he was 70. But the worst is that he admitted to basically physically abusing her and even pressuring her into getting an abortion, which is just awful. And hopefully, the woman got the support and help she needed. And Furuya has since published a public apology and said that he was willing to accept any punishment. But I don't think he should ever return to voice acting. I mean, that's just awful. And of course, with that news coming out, he was almost immediately fired and recast from all his major roles like Yamcha, Bourbon, and of course Sabo. And so as of episode 1116, he was recast with Miyu Irino, and I like him in the role. Not sure which one I like better at this point, but he's good. To me, I most recognize him as Senna, the main character running back from Ice Shield 21, as well as Sugawara, the vice captain from the Haikyuu series. So both, sports anime related. He's also the voice, or the Japanese voice, of Sora from the Kingdom Hearts video game series. There's also a third somewhat controversy surrounding Sabo's return that I can't quite get into because of spoilers, but essentially it surrounds the question of where has Sabo been this whole time if he's been alive? Why didn't he show up at Marineford to help save Ace and Luffy? If he was alive and well this entire time, why wasn't he there? And the explanation Oda gives for this is not the most satisfying. And this is where I will somewhat agree with the naysayers because it does seem rather convenient and contrived, but we'll get into that once we get to that point in the story. Now, in the other part of the island, we then get to the big plan that the Tontara and the Toy Soldier have cooked up, the grand Operation Dressrosa SOP. And I love that bit about what SOP stands for with Frankie, and in the anime they add a nice little joke that the manga didn't have, which was where Robin gets a little annoyed and tells Frankie to stop incessantly asking about what SOP stands for. And this is where we should have properly gotten the big reveal that Sugar is the one with the power to turn people into toys, with the use of her newly revealed Habi Habi no Mi, which is obviously in reference to the word hobby, which is like, saying like collecting toys is often considered a hobby that many people have, especially in Japan, where things like anime figures, plastic models, RC vehicles are widely popular with, dedicated people who have one or many of these as their hobby. And the other thing we learn, why Sugar hasn't aged, and like we thought, because toys are often associated with children, and the fruit seems to also prevent her from aging. And I always found this trait quite strange, that it's a tacked on there, but then I thought back to all like Alvida with the Subespe fruit, she becomes incredibly skinny as a result of that fruit. So I guess anything is possible. And I will comment a little bit more about this in the spoiler section, because we do get a little bit more context surrounding like how devil fruits work later on that may go to explaining this. But yeah, this reveal is definitely, again, hurt in the anime because you're already essentially told that it's Sugar and not Treble who is the one with this power. And with this, the big reveal of what SOP stands for is finally also revealed, and it stands for Sugar Over Surprised Panic. And it was fortunate that 2 out of the 3 words were already in English, but they don't get so lucky with the second word, which is Japanese. What they actually use is the word otamage for the O. And so otamageru is like to be surprised or flabbergasted. It would be the closest word, I would say. Obviously, over surprised is not quite that, but I think it actually still works. I think if you wanted to use a real word but still maintain the spirit of the word, the only word I can think of that begins with an O would be overwhelmed, but it doesn't quite capture the same sort of tone that otamageru means. But I think over surprise works. The reaction of all 3 to this plan is exactly on brand for all 3 of them, with Frankie still obsessed with how awesome the SOP name is. Robin is slightly annoyed at how obsessed Frankie still is, and Usopp as well. While Usopp himself is overjoyed that his target is seemingly a little girl, although a very terrifying one. Frankie then gives himself easily the best post-time skip hairstyle as it morphs into a cannon made of hair. And you'd think it would look dumb or ridiculous, but surprisingly, it's actually really cool looking. I also love the bit where they see the size of the secret passage to the factory, and it's barely big enough for Usopp and Robin to fit through, and Usopp just kind of matter-of-factly suggests to Frankie to just remove his shoulders and arms, as if Frankie is like a full-on like constructible robot that can be dismantled. When Frankie starts to go along with it though, and talks like he can actually do that, and he's like, sure, just let me remove these, and then he grabs for his shoulders like I can do that. And the stupid thing is, even if he could remove his huge shoulders and arms, he still wouldn't fit through that tiny hole. And I don't know, jokes like that are just really funny to me. I don't know why. With Frankie unable to fit through the hole though, the toy soldiers tells them about another entrance to the toy house, setting up the most hard-boiled fight in the arc, perhaps even the series. And so, yeah, leading up to this sort of 1v1 fight, I think it's really cool that it's not just now Luffy and Zoro who's sort of gaining that notoriety, but now the rest of the crew, including Frankie. Like, the whole lead up to this is funny, especially the comment, like, is he a weapon or is he just an idiot? And the fact that the feature that put it over the top was his triple chin. Like, this whole interaction leading up to the Senor Pink reveal is just funny as hell. With Frankie introduced, we get the proper introduction to his opponent, Senor Pink. And this guy at first probably seems like the most absolutely ridiculous joke of a character. But I think the genius about Senor Pink and why he works so well as a character is that aside from his appearance and sort of the gallery that's fawning over him, which is obviously has a purpose, and Oda writes Senor Pink and portrays everything else about him almost like with absolute sincerity and seriousness. But yeah, this appearance is so wild that even Frankie ironically asks, "Who is that pervert?" and Senor Pink is dressed like an overgrown baby, but acts like a hardened Yakuza gangster. But everyone else around him almost acts like he's not dressed like a big baby. Not only that, everyone seems to respect and adore him. You've got the men sort of like pleading for his help and admiring him, and then these like bikini clad women like fawning over him just to show how hard boiled he is. And so the first thing that he does after getting like tomato juice all over his face, he rips one of the girl's bikinis off and uses it as a napkin. It's so random, but it somehow works. I don't know why. Senor Pink is a reference to Chow Yun-fat's character in the movie titled Hard Boiled, where all this sort of theming comes from. And while I haven't seen this movie, it is apparently a more specific reference to a scene where Chow Yun-fat's character runs around in a gunfight while carrying a baby around. And there's also often people who don't know what it actually means to be hard-boiled sort of in this context, so I'll quickly define it. It's often characterized as sort of being tough and a lack of sentimentality and machismo and a very pragmatic and often cynical approach to life. And, you know, think of like your gritty noir film detectives from the 1920s and 30s. But one thing I find I love about this terminology when applied to Frankie and Senor Pink is that if you think of the other thing most people come up with in their mind when you mention hard-boiled is eggs, as in hard-boiled eggs. And unlike the strict definition, particularly the lack of sentimentality, is that you can think of them almost as literally being hard-boiled eggs almost. They both have this very hard exterior and present themselves as very hard and tough guys, but just underneath the surface, there's more to them. And particularly Frankie, we know just how much emotion is actually there, even if he tries to come off as this tough man's man. Now, I don't want to say too much when it comes to Senor Pink, but just know that there is more to him for sure, as we'll see as the fight continues. One thing we do learn about Senor Pink is that he does have a devil fruit power, the Sui Sui no Mi, or the Swim Swim fruit. Now, Sui is Japanese for water, and Suie is swimming when referred to it as the activity, so basically as a noun. The verb for swimming is oyogu, and so this fruit seemingly allows him to swim in anything, whether it be stone or the ground, although, ironically, because it's a devil fruit, he probably still can't swim in water. And to demonstrate just how hard-boiled he is, even when he got the jump on Frankie by swimming underneath and behind him, undetected, he still comes up in front of Frankie because he wouldn't be hard-boiled, you know, a manly man if he didn't attack head-on. And the gag of Senor Pink doing things and his gallery swinging all over him for every action he takes never seems to get old for me. Like, you'd think this gag would get annoying, but every time it's really funny. And I'll have more to say about this as we go on too, because it does actually play a role. And unfortunately, we only get a small taste of this hard-boiled 1v1 fight, but I will definitely be excited to cover this in the coming episodes for sure. But yeah, this episode's getting a little bit long, so we'll kind of wrap things up. With that though, the Operation Dressrosa SOP is underway. Everyone has begun to move into place to enact their parts of the plan. Robin and Usopp, with the help of Leo and the Tontada, finally make it into the factory, and what they see is a port town full of slave laborers being worked cruelly. It makes you realize that while Doflamingo may not be an official celestial dragon anymore, he still acts and thinks like one, employing this many slaves. And this is only the toys. We haven't even seen the 500 or so Tontara slaves that was mentioned earlier. Robin and Usopp have a tough task ahead of them to take out Sugar, with Treble protecting her and almost the entire facility to contend with as well. So we'll have to see how that unfolds in the next podcast. But yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing and check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates when I post new episodes and to see pictures of my manga collection and card collection. And yeah, like I always say, just listening to the podcast is well enough for me, but if you feel like extra supporting, you can check out my Buy Me a Coffee profile. As always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to the podcast. Just a small comment in the spoiler section, but if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye! Alright, so spoiler section. Obviously, there is quite a lot to talk about when it comes to spoilers in this episode with all the things revealed, but I feel like it's best to mostly talk about those when this actually happens. But the one thing I kind of wanted to mention, like I alluded to in the non-spoiler section, is the Hobi Hobi no Mi, sort of like why the aging part is also part of that fruit. And so once we got to Egghead Island, knowing now that devil fruits sort of come from people's desires and wishes, they get manifested because of people wanting, certain things, and their desires and stuff like that. I could easily see the Hobby Hobby fruit, giving the person the ability to not age, because this fruit was probably created by some kid wishing for this, to be able to turn anything he wants into, or she wants to, into a toy, and not ever have to grow up to be an adult. And I can see that sort of like that wish being made by a kid, and then that being manifested as a devil fruit. And so yeah, once I learned about that, I could almost see why that sort of power is tacked onto this fruit. Whereas, yeah, you wouldn't see that with other fruits, like with, say, the Spaspanomiy, the one that allows you to turn your limbs into blades. Like, no one's going to think about that power and then also think, yeah, I want this to be like, make me not age, or I want to be super buff with it or something like that. Like, there's no inherently, like, associated other condition that you need with this fruit. But I could easily see, like, a little kid dreaming this fruit up and also not wanting to grow up and stay a kid and be able to play with toys forever. So yeah, I definitely I like that concept, and going back and looking at sort of all the fruits power sets, and with the context of Vegapunk's sort of theory about where devil fruits come from, is very interesting. And the Hobi Hobi no Mi is definitely one of those fruits where I was really like interested in just how it changed my perspective on that fruit, and it went from a fruit that had a tacked on ability that I thought was really weird and convenient to, yeah, that makes sense now. So yeah, it is kind of cool to go back and see all the different fruit powers, and with that sort of added context of it being people's desires and wishes manifesting themselves. But anyways, that's kind of all I really wanted to talk about. This episode's also really long, so I'm going to cut it off there. But I appreciate you sticking around and listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. See ya!